The Holocaust was a series of events caused by the Nazi Party that dehumanized minorities, and more specifically Jewish people. They were chased out of their homes and taken to concentration camps. As they arrived at the camps, they underwent several processes of dehumanization. The first being a selection. Next was being given constant beatings. They then went under a series of events like giving them tattoos of numbers instead of names, giving them all the same clothes, and shaving them so they all looked identical as a way to take away their identification. This was just the beginning of the horrors that they would undergo. They were then deprived of food and put through hours of strenuous work. Thousands upon thousands of minorities were killed every day out of hatred and no other reason except that they were different.
Why should we bear witness? It is so important to remember the events that happened during the Holocaust. We should bear witness to the Holocaust because it was a very tragic event that was the cause of many lives to be taken off the earth. Not all the people were living a regular life before it happened. Then all of a sudden, their freedom, rights, and pretty much everything was taken them in an instant, just like that. A lot of people were killed and some great memories with them. We need to make sure to remember and bear witness to the horrible actions that occurred during that time so we don't repeat the events that happened.
One of the most fundamental causes of the Holocaust was the rise of anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was the discrimination towards Jewish people, disabled people, mentally ill people, and anyone else who did not agree with the terms. With the rise of anti-Semitism came the rise of the Nazi Party. The leader of the Nazis, Adolf Hitler, felt that Jews, people with disabilities, people with mental illnesses, or anyone who disagreed were inferior to him and his followers. He believed in weakening other races would further his journey into conquering the world. Hitler felt that they had no place in Germany or anywhere else on this planet and persecuted them, which led to the mass murder and deportation of minorities.
One distinctive fact of the Jews was the Star of David, and the Star of David was a technique used by the German people to discriminate the Jewish people, and it was just like a simple patch made out of a hexagon with triangles on each side, and the Jews would have to wear this for something called martyrdom, and that basically just meant people who suffered persecution and death from advocating, renouncing, refusing to renounce, and refusing to advocate a religious belief. In other words, this just meant that they refused to go by the German ways, and they just wanted to keep being Jewish, and they wanted to go by their own standards. They didn't want to go and do what everyone else wanted them to. And there was many names for the Star of David, like the Magen David, I think it's pronounced, and then also the Shield of David. And it was just a signification for the Jewish people, and it just made them easier recognized by Germans.
In the ghettos. Ghettos are holding places in which minorities live in. In this scenario, ghettos were used for Jewish people. The Nazis would invade their homes sometimes and taunt them by breaking things with sentimental value before moving them into the ghetto. Nina Kaleska, a survivor of the Holocaust, experienced something very much like this, where the Nazi would force their way into their home and break priceless china just for the fun of it as a way to taunt them before driving them out of their homes.
The train rides to the camps were horrific and vile. The Nazis gathered as many Jewish people as they could possibly find and crammed them all into one boxcar and locked the door. In the small box, there was little to no airflow and it was extremely hot. Sometimes it would be hours before the departure. Leo Schneiderman describes the conditions of the boxcars. He describes that there were no places to use the bathroom than in a metal bucket in the middle of the boxcar in front of dozens of people. He also describes how cramped the car was. He said one man was begging people to spare just a little more room for his pregnant wife so she could sit down. It was cruel and inhumane for how the Germans treated them.
When arrived at the camp, there was a table with a man of high rank separating the incoming prisoners into two groups. Most of the time, it was men and then women and children separately. Some were even sent immediately to gas chambers if they were not seen fit to work. For many people, this is the last time they would ever see their families. Aji Jiva explains the horrors of experiencing it. She was deported from Hungary to Poland and taken to Auschwitz for 2 weeks and then transported to Plazo. She was told by her mother to not tell the guards her actual age, but to lie that she was over 18. Her mother saw the people who said they were related were also separated, so she told her family not to mention it when asked. They were asked a question by a guard where Aji answered in fluent German. The guards, surprised, let the family choose whatever side they wanted to go to. They chose the surviving side.
So the Jewish people were stripped of their humanity during this time. They would enter the camp and they would go through a selection where they were taken through many series of dehumanization events. They were first designated as a specific numbers, so some people would be given a tattoo on their arms. One of the numbers was A15510, and that's how they would label prisoners. And it was just kind of wrong, like really, really wrong. Not kind of wrong, it was wrong. And they were just taken away, like all their freedoms were gone. And after they were given their numbers, they would be taken to a barber and they would shave their head clean, so every single prisoner in the camp would look the same but just have a different number. And it made them even more insane that they took their clothes and shoes and issued them striped shirts and pants, and they got no socks, no underwear, and it would eventually just drive everyone insane because they all looked the same as each other, and it just made them all crazy.
For many people, work in the camps was a life or death situation. If you had any experience in a job or strong enough to work, they would keep you. But if you couldn't work, you would be sent back to an extermination camp. David Bergman, a survivor of the Holocaust, describes his working experience at a camp. He said that he had no experience whatsoever with his profession, which was laying bricks. But since no one knew he didn't, the German soldiers just assumed that he was a professional bricklayer, which most likely saved him his life. Many jobs were an escape for the Jewish people in the camps because they protected thousands of people from potentially being killed.
The food in the camps. Prior to the war, prisoners would typically be given an early breakfast of bread or porridge, accompanied by tea or ersatz, coffee served in tin bowls and mugs. Lunch would be vegetable soup, occasionally served with meager portions of bread. Dinner would be more soup, or in some of the earlier camps, bread and cheese. During the war, prisoners' food rations were cut back in order to preserve more food for the soldiers. Most of the prisoners were really only given tiny rations of bread. This was extremely difficult for the people because now that their food was cut back, most of them were hungry all the time. Some prisoners even died of starvation, and from there on they were fed the bare minimum to keep them alive. To bring attention to the starving and ill prisoners in the camp, we are donating to nearby food banks to help feed people who are starving.
So basically, why the Germans removed all their clothes from the other people, yes, they wanted to make sure that everyone had the same thing and there was no distinct difference. But a lot of these people had some really nice clothing and they all had value. So the Germans would take any and all personal belongings, including these clothes, and they would just try to get any value that they could out of these. And some of the prisoners were selected to be workers that were collecting these clothes from the other prisoners, and they would sort them out and give them to the Germans. And a few of them would kind of take this as like a rebellion, and they could rip, tear, or do anything to the clothes to make them lose value. So the plan would end up backfiring on the Germans, and they would be wasting all of these materials on the clothes, and they would get nothing out of it.
The punishments at the camp were brutal and harsh. They were given out very frequently as a way to break down the prisoners. At Auschwitz, punishments were applied on the basis of written orders from the camp director. The most common punishments were starvation, isolation, and execution. To do these cruelties to a human being is so morbid and inhuman to think about, because they are just like every other human being with a heart and a pulse. Most of these cruel punishments are given out if they committed a crime, such as attempting to acquire additional rations, working in an unsatisfactory way, trying to minimize work, attempting to commit suicide, and smuggling weapons.
The gas chambers and crematoriums. The first camp to introduce gas chambers was Belzec in Poland. They used carbon monoxide gas generated by diesel engines to murder thousands of Jews. The Nazis used a horrific, cruel, and appalling trick to trap the Jews going into the chambers. They would tell them that they were going to take a shower after they had been transported there, and they would cramp as many people into the room as possible, sometimes even making the children crawl on top of the adults. They would cram a ton of people into the same room because it would kill them in a larger number, and they would suffocate a lot faster. After several minutes, the Jewish workers would go in and clean the bodies from the floor. Some of them would still be alive after the gas was sprayed.
So throughout the Holocaust, there were many diseases and sicknesses. The overall conditions of the camp life ensured that many people felt sick from the very first few months, and then the numbers just kept kind of rising. There were definitely some physical harassments of the prisoners, and that would result in some broken limbs and other sores and stuff. And then throughout the winter and late fall, early spring, you could see some more cases of cold, pneumonia, frostbite, which developed into just like many more problems with the human body. And there was many sanitation problems as well. Like, it would cause skin diseases and rashes, boils, absences of skin cancer, and all of this would just keep spreading slowly throughout the entire camp. And eventually most of the people were either very, very sick, or they were just starving to death. And all of these diseases were just kept spreading, and it ended up very bad for all the prisoners.
Even if the inmates weren't injured, they were treated horribly. They did not care for the inmates' health or welfare. Ghettos, concentration camps, and forest hideouts were distinct locations where Jewish doctors continued to care for the sick, the injured, and the dying during the Holocaust. Throughout Hitler's Europe, the medical consideration had been canceled, banning them for treating non-Jewish patients. If the inmates that were injured did not heal within a certain amount of time, they were thrown out of the hospital for new patients to come in. Where they would lay was also horrible. The prisoners, most of them extremely exhausted, often unconscious or in agony, lay in overcrowded rooms in shirts darkened with filth or naked, on paper pads soaked with excrement, urine, and pus.
Liberation was one of the most astonishing moments in history. It was revealed that thousands of Jewish and other minorities were being dehumanized and persecuted. When they first came in contact with the Allies, they were given food, water, and clothes. Although they were given food and water, many of the minorities in the camp fell ill because of how previously starved they were. George Salton describes his liberation. When he was liberated, he was extremely ill, weak, and deathly skinny. He explains that if it hadn't been that week he was liberated, he would have had most definitely died because he was reaching a point in which most prisoners didn't care if they lived. His legs were skin and bones, and his hips hurt him because of the lack of food, water, and rest. As a way to contribute to the liberation, we are going to be donating food and clothes to a food pantry and a clothes drop-off box.
Thousands of Jewish people suffered from trauma after the war because the events that the Jewish people had gone through were so horrific and inhumane. Some of the Jewish people were just left in the camps to sit there and starve. Peter Gorog, the survivor of the Holocaust, explains his difficulty after the war. Gorog had a 26 cubic feet refrigerator, always stocked with, even if it was way expired, because of the fear of starvation and not having enough food. This just did not happen to him. 25 other survivors were experiencing the same trauma with overpacking their fridge.